They say when you start a business, you should have your exit plan figured out from day one. It might change, but you should always have one. Maybe that's a good idea for life in general, no matter how old you are. But it's not that easy getting out of here the way you want. It takes planning and preparation and probably a partner to run interference and advocate on your behalf. So far, we've been talking about our understanding of death anxiety in general, its roots in our approach inhibition neurophysiology, its cultural expressions and remedies. And we've talked about ways to strengthen certain capabilities related to handling uncertainty. Hopefully, it can be applicable to anyone at any point in the lifespan. Now let's turn our attention to the active dying part of life. Being mortal and dealing with it in a healthy way is pretty much a lifetime learning kind of thing. Actually dying and staying that way is a one-time deal. That's why we've tried to focus on how to help people hold their mortality more comfortably throughout life. But preparation for the act of dying itself is part of the acceptance, part of the willing the obligatory. So let's talk exit strategies.
First of all, consider what will probably happen if, like most people, you don't put some serious intentionality into managing your exit. You'll be medicalized. You'll leave the world you know, suddenly or gradually, for an institutional world of procedures, basically designed around cost containment and risk reduction. Plenty of people have been talking about medicalization for a long time, and all I'm saying here is that it intensifies at the end of life. In normal life, institutions are important, but in the time of active dying, an institution becomes the world, and no one is much of a player at all anymore. What's common to all of the technologies used, hard and soft, is the end of your role as an effective agent. The institution, not the patient, sets the goals, and there's really only one that matters: keep you alive as currently defined in the statutes. Okay, but right off the bat, you got a really tough question in making up your strategy. And here's the question, I've asked it before: when is the start of the end of life? There's not really even a good name for it. Terminal bardo is a phase in the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Do you need to be told that you have an incurable disease to begin your good death? Or is the clear and distinct awareness of mortality enough to begin at any time? Because it could, of course, happen at any time. Sudden and unexpected death. That's how about 15% of Americans go every day, about 1,200 of them. In the terms we've been using, death is expected, and a certain kind of dying is the expected way that uncertainty will be resolved over time. But sudden and unexpected death is the unexpected uncertainty. When you try to take this into account in your exit strategy, I think it's about planning life as if you're normative, but allowing for the possibility that you're not. That means personally, interpersonally, and legally. When people think about this at all, they have kind of a vague image of drifting away peacefully at home, which most of us claim to prefer. Well, first, all things being equal, the sweet home death scenario doesn't stand a chance against the sort of competing, dominant, high-tech scenario that is really the most likely thing to happen. Because, in fact, while 85% of people say they would like to die at home, less than 15% actually do. Why do most people die in institutions, even though they said they wanted to die at home? Maybe they changed their mind because of fear, and they sort of go for full compliance with an all-out life extension approach. Or maybe it's other reasons. It's not easy to turn away from the undying hope that life extension at any price could somehow mean remission. Everything will be back to the way it was. Being in a state of utter dependency to machines may seem pretty unappealing to a healthy person, but not so bad to a dying one. Because the technology is available to extend life, does it have to be used? Because medicalization can do so much, the question has shifted from the acceptability of doing something to the acceptability of not doing something. Let's look back just a little and see how that happened. Pope Pius XII was one of the first major world figures to recognize the new form of dilemma when he distinguished in 1957 between extraordinary means of sustaining life and the more ordinary means. He actually said, Means that do not involve any grave burden for oneself or another. A more strict obligation would be too burdensome for most men and would render the attainment of the higher, more important good too difficult. Life, health, all temporal activities are in fact subordinated to spiritual ends. Well, obviously the terminology will need some fine-tuning, or we should say generalizing, over the next several decades, but here it is in a nutshell. No one should have to use extraordinary means to sustain life because it's not good for your spiritual development. End of story. You define spiritual. Lacking an infallible central authority, however, the world in general has more difficulty with matters like this than the Roman Catholic Church. In the 50 or so years since Pope Pius XII took explicit notice of artificial lung ventilation, nations and states, doctors and consumers have struggled to legalize and define the distinction he made. The 60s was a bad decade for old taboos. Some fell fast and hard, while others, like death, began a long, slow process of grudging accommodation. When Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross started interviewing dying people at the University of Chicago, along with a small group of theology students, she was on her way to a seminal on death and dying, published in 1969. With less notice, Dame Cicely Saunders toured America as early as 1963 to speak about palliative care and a patient-centered end of life. She founded St. Christopher's, the first modern hospice, in 1967 in South London. Living wills were another child of the 60s. The idea that people shouldn't have to use all available technology to sustain life if they don't want to expressed the spirit of the times. Credit for the term is given not to a doctor or a thanatologist, but to an international law specialist named Louis Kuttner. It tells you something about change, which is the law grows by extending precedents. Kuttner's idea was to extrapolate from a state law, which allows people to control assets after they're not here through documents written in advance, like wills. Well, he extrapolated this into healthcare. Why shouldn't people be able to write legal documents to control healthcare treatment when they're no longer fully present and able to make those decisions? This shifts the discussion away from the Pope's spiritual development idea and over to previously established legal capabilities. While death's new rules were being questioned, the death establishment was busy changing them. Fantastic new tools for keeping people alive didn't just affect patients' rights, it affected the people most invested in those tools, doctors. In 1968, a true opinion leader moment took place when an ad hoc committee at Harvard Medical School proclaimed that cessation of brain function should constitute the legal criteria for death, not the cardiopulmonary factors which had reigned for so long. The AMA soon endorsed this perspective, and death had a new meaning. Someone for whom machines have completely replaced heart and lung functions is alive, as long as there is something to read on an EEG. Karen Quinlan was the first right-to-die media star. She was in a persistent vegetative state, but the picture on TV and in the tabloids was a high school yearbook shot that could have been anyone. Her parents wanted to take her off the ventilator, but the doctor saw that as a breach of ethics. The family was Catholic, and Pope Pius XII's specific references to ventilators as extraordinary were extensively quoted in the legal proceedings. The case went to the New Jersey Supreme Court in 1976, where her parents got everything they needed, if not what they wanted: the right to speak for her, and the right to refuse the treatment of the ventilator. The proverbial plug was pulled, and Karen Quinlan did not die. It turned out she could breathe on her own, and actually did for 9 more years, until pneumonia became the official cause of her death. While her high-profile moments set precedents, it's Karen Quinlan's long period of distinctly anticlimactic non-death which most poignantly illustrates the detailed choices to be made. Her parents could not bring themselves to withhold food or antibiotics all those years, maybe because those steps were not, to them, extraordinary measures. Shortly after Karen Quinlan held a share of the national attention, almost 10 years after Kuttner floated the idea, California became the first state to recognize living wills. With its January 1977 Natural Death Act, a state finally gave legal recognition to the right to refuse treatment. Many others followed soon, but the issues were nowhere near resolved. Palliative care emerged into the new mix of ideas and options with the establishment of Hospice, Inc. by Florence Wald, who was dean of the Yale School of Nursing, and it was on the heels of her 2-year apprenticeship in London at St. Christopher's. Hospice immediately spread in a distinctive American form, less rooted in medical tradition and something more like a movement, with lots of volunteers and a low-tech spirit. Hospice sidesteps the relentless medical drive to cure people by creating an arbitrarily defined and fundamentally undefinable special category, the dying person, someone who doesn't have to be cured anymore. Hold that thought. We'll be digging into hospice in just a bit when we start to see the economic implications of that charter. Hospice is, to some, a strange idea, but an even stranger one produced a bestseller about near-death experiences in 1975 for Raymond Moody, doctor of philosophy and a doctor of medicine. Moody, like Kubler-Ross before him, wasn't scientific in any professional sense of the word, but his model, based on interviewing a significant number of people, of what happens to people who are legally dead and then, for some unknown reason, come back, well, it caught the popular imagination, and it's remained pretty much intact ever since, floating above your body, the clear white light, the guide or helper. Death got updated in 1981, officially. Medical reconsideration had begun decades earlier, officially, in 1968, back at Harvard. But once those no longer essential organs like hearts and lungs can be replaced by technology, where does that leave death? Even death doesn't rate a presidential commission unless there's something at stake, like the high costs and the disproportionate claim on resources at the very end, and the organs to be harvested for needy living people. This is what the commission came up with, the beginning of Death 2.0. The famous flat line in practice becomes the main criteria. Society moves from standards pretty much anyone can judge to unseen forces measurable only with instruments. Death 2.0 is not a stable version yet, because exactly which unseen inner forces is a matter of debate. Emphasizing the whole brain and specifically naming the brainstem, the Commission took a conservative position, arguing essentially that all brain parts are equal, and they've all got to flatline before it's over. Others disagree, and the Commission knew it. It replied to the higher brain, lower brain idea basically by saying that no one really knows what makes a person and where it lives, if there is such a thing. And just to make this real, at that exact time when the Commission was in session, Karen Quinlan was 5 years into a period of sufficient brain stem activity to maintain breathing, even though her cerebral area was irreversibly damaged. Repeat, she was breathing on her own. If the Commission had sided with the higher brain position, they would have been saying, that girl lying there breathing is dead. The end. Betty Rowland exemplified the anxieties around dying under a system uncertain of its powers and legal limits. Already well known as an NBC correspondent and the author of a best-selling book about battling breast cancer, she helped her mother die and wrote about it in 1985 in Last Wish. Well, efforts intensified on all fronts. The living will concept itself split into two distinct threads as it became clear that no written statement could anticipate everything, and so representation would be needed as well. First, advanced healthcare directives were used to express treatment preferences, and then second, the appointment of durable healthcare agents, or proxies, clarified decision-making. One response to the lack of mainstream medical clarity was the Hemlock Society, founded in 1980 by Derek Humphrey, who had helped his wife, who had terminal bone cancer, end her life 5 years earlier. Humphrey told people how to do it themselves and became the focal point of an assisted death movement. Hospice, with an explicit focus on comfort and preparation, is less radical than something like the Hemlock Society and remains fully within the tradition of refusing treatment only. This positioning gained eligibility for the complete set of hospice services under Medicare in 1982. The supported dying business boomed. through small nonprofits at first, and then increasingly through the involvement of large hospitals. The Patient Self-Determination Act, enacted in 1991 under President George H.W. Bush, is about communication more than anything else. It's one thing for advanced care directives to exist. It's quite another to ensure that people know about them and are supported in their efforts to complete them. The Self-Determination Act simply made it mandatory for healthcare facilities to inform patients about living wills and the right to refuse treatment. The name self-determination is kind of misleading because the principle of patient self-determination with respect to refusing treatment was already established. The 1991 Act was supposed to get people talking about it. That's all. Inform patients in writing. Educate staff. Simple, obvious stuff. By and large, these simple and obvious new federal rules have not made much difference. The letter of the law is carried out in the majority of cases, according to plenty of studies, but the intent implied in the stirring if misleading title, Patient Self-Determination, has not really been realized. The number of advanced care directives did not shoot rapidly up, and more importantly, directives were frequently not consulted or adhered to when they were available. Death is under attack on multiple fronts. Delay it. Eliminate it, potentially forever. Google is trying to defeat it. Ray Kurzweil is trying to merge us with robots to create a singularity and defeat death that way. In the latest vampire therapy, young blood might reverse cell aging. Investment in life extension and the reversal of cell death also continues and expands. Geneticists and microbiologists are beyond treating disease. They're trying to re-engineer everyone to live longer. That's the frontier now. Other scientists explore post-clinical death experiences in cardiac arrest patients to verify and explain certain elements of that near-death model. The baby boomer generation has a history of wanting life to be personally meaningful. Many baby boomers will want to experience the dying process on their own terms as much as possible, as they always have. But actually, dying doesn't work out the way they thought for most people, and no one is going to be dictating terms to death anytime real soon. The whole idea of doing battle with death, conquering and defeating it, it's a losing proposition, maybe heroic, but losing. Death is its own chapter with different rules than any other. Acceptance isn't giving in and losing something. In this relatively short, and possibly frightening phase of life, it's the only way to stay positive and die the kind of death most people say they want to die. Accepting what's gone and working with what's left to make your death a way to express yourself, it isn't a bad project to end on. To me, Terri Schiavo represents one face of 21st century dying. After a long legal battle, her husband, Michael Schiavo, won the right to end treatment for his wife in April 2001, in an act that was seen as the only humane response by one side and as unthinkably inhuman by the other. The tube was then reinserted several days later on the basis of new legal decisions. In a persistent vegetative state for years, Terri Schiavo became a symbol, a rallying point for opposing forces in an increasingly polarized United States of America. Groups which supported no taking of life across the lifespan brought tremendous political clout to bear on the maintenance of Schiavo's feeding tube, including President George W. Bush, who cut short a summer vacation just to keep the tube in place. It turned out to be an ineffective gesture, as life support was discontinued, and Terri Schiavo died at Pinellas Park Hospital in March 2005. But the way Terri Schiavo died showed that, as always, institutional acceptance of personal satisfaction and self-expression will not come easily. Starting in the 1960s, the baby boomers who wanted things their way have shown a remarkably low level of sensitivity toward those who are not at all interested in redefining traditional values. And traditionalist problems with change advocates in general are well known. As a result, cultural wars have marked much of the past 50 years. The Battle of Terri Schiavo was long and ferocious out of all proportion to the final number of deaths. The more conservative forces took a stand there and lost the battle in the end, but served notice in the larger war that patient self-determination is far from accepted. It also shows that not documenting your wishes can be a big mistake. Under the special rules of hospice, however, the freedom to dictate the terms of the treatment appears to be secure and absolute. Medicare support reached $10 billion by 2007, with for-profit providers as the fastest-growing slice of the industry. Investors are betting on home death, or at least home-like death. But I definitely need to emphasize that there's nothing magic about the institution of hospice. Where there's big money involved, organizations will inevitably learn ways to maximize net income. Here's two of them in the hospice business. One, bill at Medicare's highest allowable crisis service rates. Have as many patients in crisis as possible, determined by the provider, not the patients. And number two, I think an even more insidious technique is cherry-picking clients from assisted living communities when they may not need it so much, because they're often in the sweet spot then. They're the easy cases. Then, after 6 months and they're still alive, they most frequently get discharged, just when their toughest times are still ahead, and it may be hard to get back on. The U.S. Department of Justice last May filed suit against the country's largest for-profit hospice chain, Vitas Hospice Services, and the Department of Justice alleges that the company, quote, knowingly submitted false claims for hospice care for patients who were not terminally ill, unquote, and paid bonuses to staff based on number of patients enrolled and longer lengths of stay, according to a news release. The company's CEO has denied the allegations and vowed to, quote, vigorously defend its compliance record and industry leadership, unquote.
Whether it's in a hospice or a progressive hospital or in an accountable care organization established under the Affordable Care Act, what I'm talking about is the counterpoint to the medicalization of end of life is an option that's based on palliative care and personal support. In fact, the hospice model is made for Obamacare and its system of pay for performance for patients who do not prioritize life extension at all times. It's not about rationing health care, it's about letting people choose the level of health care they want. Hospice appeals to a segment of the population which is not necessarily against technology, simply against the potential overuse and the bureaucratically inflexible use of technology. The idea of hospice has always been to have a place where people can prepare for the transition. Since that's pretty much the theme of this workshop, I'd like to conclude by looking at hospice and people actually dying in some detail, extracting the main points of the hospice way of helping people die.
There's two main forms of hospice. First, residential support, which I did as a volunteer with Kaiser. It's what most hospice is. It's all Medicare covered, keeping people where they are, in their private home, maybe in assisted living, in a nursing home, a hospital, a rehab facility. This is mostly what for-profit hospice companies do. It's actually the top. We're in the top 5 fastest growing private businesses in America today, for-profit hospice. Drugs and nurse and social worker, chaplain, all billable services. I mostly went into people's homes a lot on Sunday morning so the family could go to church, for instance, and I'd stay there with the dying person. I cleaned up for people who couldn't do it anymore. I went shopping, and I just watched TV with folks a lot. Talked about the meaning of life a little. Then there's full residential hospice support. First, we do this on a complete hospice-dedicated wing at Laguna Honda Hospital in San Francisco, a hospital made semi-famous in a book published called God's Waiting Room. We have volunteers there 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week. We also have our own residential facility at Zen Hospice Project. It's a beautiful Victorian house in the Hayes Valley, now sometimes called Zen Valley, neighborhood of San Francisco. It's across from the San Francisco Zen Center, and Zen Hospice was once a part of the San Francisco Zen Center. Residential services are not billable under Medicare. The drugs and nursing services, yes. Room rate, no. That has to be private pay, and we also have donations, beds that are covered by larger hospital and health maintenance organizations like UCSF or Kaiser, because we're more efficient actually as a place for some of their patients. So there's a number of ways that the residential fee can be paid for in hospice, but it is, again, not covered automatically by Medicare. Zen Hospice grew out of the AIDS epidemic back in the 80s. People needed a place to die. Everyone was afraid of them with an unknown disease. People are still afraid, not just of AIDS, but of death and dying. I've seen people sit out in the car for an hour because they can't make themselves come in to our hospice for whatever reason. We have to know that right there as we greet people here at this front door. People like knowing that there's volunteers who don't have to be here and who aren't even being paid, who just want to support their mom or dad. People actually project angelic qualities onto us because it makes them feel good to think of angelic people around their loved ones. I understand that. We have a great room where families hang out. The piano over there gets played. In fact, there's lots of music in the house. There's a group called the Threshold Chorus that comes to sing to our guests. People come to play music here. There's also a lot of food. There's a kitchen staff that serves guests and helps them. Food gets to be a very big deal at the end. I could talk a lot just about this subtopic. Families focus a lot of their helplessness on making sure their loved one eats. Even if it's not really best for the dying person, the family member needs to feel like they're helping. It gets tricky. Our rooms are home-like with the special beds and stuff. We spend a lot of time just sitting, being there, maybe lightly holding or providing a touch or massage, foot massage. What do you see in these people? They're happy. Sometimes people rally and get somewhat better after they get to our house. We have families visiting a lot. So what are the important parts of the dying process, the very end, that we can think about and prepare for and try to make sure we get something close to what we had in mind? We're not going to touch every base, and there's probably some questions that don't even fit into these categories, but let's start taking a look inside and think about what might contribute to a good death, meaning the very end. Attention to pain becomes kind of the ruling force of daily existence at end of life for most people. People are constantly asking dying people about it, and they're constantly thinking about it. The best painkiller is company and conversation. It diverts attention more than anything. It makes sense to assume there will be pain. If there isn't, you got lucky. Preparation can't make pain not happen, but it can change the levels that demand our full attention. Preparation means having good distractions available, whatever that might be. Watching funny TV shows has been shown to help kids tolerate pain. Having plants around help people tolerate pain. People help people tolerate pain. Music, books on tape. I spent hours watching I Love Lucy with a 94-year-old dementia patient who was also in pain. A realistic goal would be to have no distracting levels of pain most of the time. When most people imagine dying, they don't imagine themselves being immobile or unable to feed themselves or bathe themselves and the rest of it. Activities of daily living, ADL, measure the help a person needs in these basics. The ascending line means diminishing function. Charts like this exist for every disease, age-adjusted versions too. This aspect of dying, loss of function, is about transitions. Where do you have to be at to move on? It's worth thinking ahead of time about what loss of function would trigger which move to a more supportive environment. Reconciliation with important people is a key theme. It may be possible that things once so difficult change their appearance in the light of imminent death. The last goodbye is an old standby, but that's a limited interaction. There's no energy left. This is probably not the best time to really say goodbye. Maybe think about a final goodbye at the end of a whole series of richer and more personally connected goodbyes, where all the things that need to be said are said. In the most important relationships, this might not even happen all at once. The best goodbyes might be long goodbyes. Would Edwin Schneidman's 7 days give you enough time? We don't know what's going to happen, so it's probably best to keep fairly up to date with the important goodbye material. Don't count on getting it all out at the end. When we imagine dying from what we think is a distance, we see place as important. There's a lot about death that just happens, and where it happens is no different. If place matters, things can't be allowed to just happen. Focused intentionality is required, and chances are this will not be the dying person's strong suit. Advocacy is needed to achieve Edwin Schneidman's vision of a civilized dying scene, with fresh flowers, beautiful pictures, cherished music. All this may not matter to you when you're actually dying, as concern about surroundings diminishes as the end approaches.
Acceptance is the key word you hear. But what about Dylan Thomas and do not go gentle into the night? Rage against the dying of the light. Where's the acceptance there? Did he really think we should be dragged off the stage yelling and screaming? That his own father should exit that way because that's who he was writing to? I don't think this is meant to be taken as carefully considered advice about the good death. I think it's more like an exhortation, a son not wanting to see his once robust father with a high ADL. But it does get to the question of seeing yourself in a battle, a fight against death. One you know you'll lose in the end, but it's worth fighting to hold out as long as possible. This is classic. People say it is this attitude that keeps them alive, past whatever date the doctors had given them.
Acceptance is one of Edwin Schneidman's 10 criteria, willing the obligatory. Is attitude incompatible with raging? Maybe there's room for a little rage in acceptance. Do not go gentle acknowledges that death will win in every stanza, so in a sense acceptance is implicit from start to finish. It's not like this is a poem about denial. Angry and energetic acceptance, definitely not a mellow rollover. Don't give in easily. Don't go down without a fight. A son's eye view of a father's good death. There can be an element of feistiness in the mix. It's not too hard to get angry about having to die. Maybe there's a kind of acceptance that has room in it for some of the anger, a feisty acceptance.
You hear a lot about a certain point, which we will somehow just know, where some combination of dependency, dysfunction, pain, and nausea will make us want to hasten death. Not everyone feels this way. Plenty of people don't think about the end of their life at all. And for those that do, some will prefer full-out life-prolonging measures until the legal definition of death is reached. But for those who do have a feeling about that certain point, maybe it's worth trying to grasp a little bit more of the characteristics, the features of that point. First, the feeling of being utterly dependent isn't new. We've all been there. There's a reason for our very dependent beginning. There's advantages to be gained. Well, there could be at the end, too. Preparations for another transition that seemed like the end of it all, but then the first one probably did, too, at the time. Constant pain and nausea are two very tough cookies. We've all experienced both, so it's not like there's some blast from our distant past. In fact, we've all had plenty of time to come up with coping strategies when these twin bummers appear. For those who have not suffered horrific accidents or felt unimaginable pain, we assume end of life will bring pain to a whole new level, and that's probably an excellent assumption. Until we think of all the pain we have already lived through and coped with. We've become experts at managing the pain that's in our lives. Pain strategies help define who we are as much as almost anything. We are how we handle pain. Some kinds of pain seem to lift after continuous effort despite the pain, like a runner breaking through into a second wind. Some kind of ultra-clear payoff for sticking with it. I don't think there's any guarantee that this will happen at the end of life, but I've seen that it often does. Death talk can be confusing sometimes because the term refers to both a process and an event. Death as an event suggests possible configurations for making a death event occur. In death as a process, we think more about the ways we can gently speed things up through inaction, ways that can influence, not control, but influence pretty substantially. Voluntarily ceasing to eat or drink, sometimes called natural dying, is an example of death by inaction, stopping the things needed for life. It takes about 10 days to 2 weeks, but it could be much less depending on the person's condition. It looks painless, and it also looks that it gets easier as it goes along. Laying out the range of options this way can be helpful to people, especially way before they are dying. What sums it all up for me is this oddly somewhat unknown poem by an oddly somewhat unknown poet, I guess, named Francis Quarles, who wrote, "If thou expect death as a friend, prepare to entertain it. If thou expect death as an enemy, prepare to overcome it. Death has no advantage except when it comes as a stranger."